G'day, welcome to Pay It Forward. Today I've got a really quick little project for you all. You can sew this little one up on your machine, completely on your machine, and it is a little mini quilt featuring two little kitties in love. And I've actually just dived into my stash of little scrap fabrics and made this one up, so perhaps you could have a little look through yours and see what you've got to suit this little project. Of course, it can be a wall hanging, it can be a placemat, whatever you like. I'm sure there's many uses for it. All you need to do is click on the link in the description below. You'll find your free pattern templates and we can get started. So let me go through with you the things you'll need to make up this little quilt. Now, I've designed it in such a way that the center panel is actually split across the middle there. We're going to be sewing a seam that gives us a nice straight line for the top of that little wall. You'll need this part of your panel to be something that indicates the night sky. I've obviously gone for a purple. You could use a midnight blue, even a very rich orange like the sun setting. That sort of look would work as well. And I'm sure there's plenty of fabrics out there. You can probably even get a fabric that is the night sky in a blue, I think you'll find. I've just taken all of this just from my scrap stash. So, and those pieces, the measurements for those pieces are there with your pattern templates. You'll also need a piece for your moon, and that's nice just in a very tight print and in that lovely pale yellow, so that piece will do fine. And you're also going to need, of course, your little kitties. Make sure when you're tracing those out that you trace them out reversed the way that you want them to be sitting. Okay, so we're going to have them facing each other and they're just going to be sitting right there. Now I've cut them out of felt and they have heat and bond on the back, as does the little moon piece. And then you need your side panels and your top panels strips, and they are, your measurements for those are also there, and they are also interfaced with that same fusible woven interfacing. You'll need a piece of fine wadding just for the back. It gives your little mini quilt some substance, and it makes it great for a little placemat and so on. It can take a little bit of heat. I've added some heat and bond to the back of my wadding because it wasn't fusible. It's just so that I can fuse it on. You don't have to use a fusible wadding, but it's just helpful if you have that. And you'll also need a piece of fabric, which I have already with my interfacing on, that I'm going to cut my back piece from, and we do that once we've got our front assembled. And you'll also need probably embroidery thread would be best. I'm just using my Gutermann top stitching thread in a white just to stitch on a few little stars. So you can see it's a very, very simple design, but it's very striking because it's quite bold. And the beauty of it, of course, is that the entire thing can be sewn on your sewing machine, and it's very, very quick to make. So let's get started. The first thing that we need to do is we're going to take our top center panel and our little lower center panel, and we're going to line them up. It's important that we get this little seam here nice and straight, because that's our little wall line there. So that seam allowance is 4 millimeters, and we're just going to stitch very carefully straight across the top there. Then we're going to press that one open and press that little seam open and flat. I have my seam all pressed out there. You can see that it's pressed nice and flat on the back. We want everything to be as flat as possible. And you can see that I've gone ahead and I've pressed on using a hot iron and a protective cloth, and I've pressed on my little moon piece. And where that little moon piece sits is just 1 3/4 centimeters from the line of your little wall there. So straight up, 1 3/4 centimeters, and it's around about 5.5 centimeters from each side. Make sure that it is centered. And then I've gone ahead and I've stitched on the machine just a straight stitch very close to that edge. Make sure that you use a matching thread with the little moon piece. And you can treat these shapes any way you like. I'm doing it very quickly on the machine because it's nice to have something that you can put together, you know, just in an hour or so. And but you could go ahead and blanket applique these shapes on. which is absolutely fine, or perhaps you might want to do a close zigzag stitch or a satin stitch around that moon. It's entirely up to you. So our next step then is to remove our backing paper, and we're going to pop our little kitties on, and you can put them as close to each other as you like. Just make sure that they're just sitting just over that line there, because we don't want any spaces there. So just sitting over that line, and make sure that the little line of the little, I'm thinking this is the little boy cat. Make sure that that little line there is lined up so that he's sitting in the correct position, and his little tail is sitting down here, and his little foot is sitting up here. And so we'll press those into place, and then I will go ahead and do exactly the same thing, only I'll be using a black thread on my machine, and I will be sewing right around the outside of each of those little kitty pieces. And on the tail section, I'll just sew one line of stitching right up. It just makes it easier because it's a very fine little piece, and it'll hold it in place nicely. Now that I have my little kitty sewn into place there, and the good thing about sewing on a black silhouette like this with your black thread is if you do find it a little bit tricky going around shapes like this, it's really quite invisible, that black thread. So if you go a little wobbly or wonky here and there, it really won't be seen, so that's not a problem at all. So now our next step is to add our side panels, which are our two shorter pieces, and we just line those up on those two sides, make sure that they're nice and straight, and we're going to be sewing just a straight stitch, make sure that it's right sides together, and we're going to be using the same 4mm seam allowance to stitch that one on and that one on, and then we're going to press those seams open and flat just as we did with this one. You can see there that I have pressed those seams nice and flat. Like I said before, we want the little quilt face to be sitting all nice and as flat as possible. Now we're just going to repeat the same process with those top and bottom panels. If you've got a little bit of overlap, don't worry about that, because we'll be squaring that up afterwards. We can always trim it up after, and exactly the same seam allowance, just stitching those top and bottom at 4mm and pressing those seams open just as we did the sides. And there we have a little quilt front all sewn up and all nicely pressed, and flip that one over and you can see that I've pressed my little piece of fleece on there, and it is a little smaller than our front panel. The reason for that is that I like to have less bulk around those seams. Now, I'm not a quilter. I've never professed to be a quilter. The way that I put things together is how they make sense to me. And so we're going to be sewing the back onto the front section, sewing all the way around, and we're going to be turning that one through. So that's why I like these areas to be free of the wadding. So the way to cut your wadding piece is, your back piece is your assembled front. You just lay on your fabric that you have ready, trace around the outside, and you cut out your back piece. And then all we need to do is line that one all up. If you have some little short pieces here and there, don't worry about that, because we can just sew our seam and we will square that all up nicely. And you just need to match up all your seams. Now we're going to be leaving an opening to turn this one through, probably around about 7 or 8 centimeters, just to be able to turn it through. And I like to do that at the bottom because it's less visible at the bottom. We want all our top lines to be nice and straight. And if you're going to be adding, now for this one myself, I'm just using mine just as a placemat, so it's just going to be sitting on a table. There's so many uses for these. They could be, you know, a wall hanging, which means you want to add, at this stage, you'll want to add a couple of little ribbon loops or a couple of little ties into your seam here. So you will tuck that little piece of ribbon in between those two pieces there, and then as you sew up your little quilt, they will be caught up in the seam, and then you'll be able to add a quilt hanger, add a piece of dowel or something like that. Alternatively, you may just want to add one piece of ribbon in the center just to hang that one, because they will hang quite straight so long as you get it nicely centered. It just depends on what you're using your little quilt for. But mine will be just sitting flat, so I don't need to add anything into that seam. So I'll be sewing right the way around, and then I will just trim off my corners so that we can push those little points out well, and I'll be turning it through. So there is my little mini quilt, all corners pushed out and nicely pressed, and you can see that I've pressed that little opening under. And what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this one back to my machine. Now, you very clever quilters out there can quilt this any way that you like. I'm just going to sew a top stitch right close to the edge all the way around in a black, and that will close that opening. And I'm also going to stitch just that square in. I'm going to stitch right in the ditch, right along the seam line, along there, and then I'm going to stitch along this little section here, and that's just going to hold that quilt all nicely together. Also, sewing your little stars in, I'm going to do them last here right through the quilt, which means I'm going to have stitching on the back of my quilt. If you don't want any stitching to be showing on the back, you can do sew those little stars in before you put your quilt front onto your quilt back. So I'm just going to go and do that little stitching, and we will then add our little stars. So now that I have done all of my stitching, my quilt is sitting lovely and flat there now, and it really does help hold all those layers together. So I'm just going to add my little stars, and you can see there that whatever I do on one side, I don't repeat on the other. If we do exactly the same on both sides, it's just too matchy-matchy. It's not pleasing to the eye. When we put a picture together, we never have it super matching either side. So I've got 4 little stars on this side, and they're quite randomly placed, and then I've just done 3 little stars on this side, and also changed the shape slightly just by dropping one of those stitches a little longer. Make some of them a little fuller and some of them a little smaller, and that mixes it up a little, and it really does change the look of the quilt. So I've just come in from behind. I've got a little knot at the end of my thread, and I'm just going to take my first stitch, and you could even use metallic thread for this, which would look really, really nice. It'll really shine up. Another thought I had was that you could, perhaps if you were making this for a child's room and it was something that was going to hang on their wall, somebody who loves their little kitty very much, you could add in the center of each of these little stars, you could just pop a little hot glue diamante on there, and that would be really sweet, and it would give it a little bit of shine. And you can see there that I'm just making a little asterisk there with my thread, and it's quite simple to do. You can use a thicker thread, of course. If you're using embroidery floss, I would probably use 2 strands. But you can see there that I've just made my one little star, and I'm going to go ahead and add in as many others as I like, just making sure that I keep it all nice and random. And there we have the finished little mini quilt. My little stars are all stitched into place there. You can see how good they would look. They would look fabulous as a set of placemats for your table, in all sorts of colours. I do think that the black around the outside, if you use a black print around that border, it really does pull the whole thing together really well. Keeps with that really bold look. So I hope you've enjoyed making them. Another idea for them would be it occurred to me while I was making this one that wouldn't it be great for if you have a little kitty to pop their little food bowl on there. That would be very sweet. I hope you've enjoyed making it with me. Well, thank you all for sewing with me today. I hope you've enjoyed making this little project. If you have, you could give me a thumbs up. That would be absolutely beautiful. In the meantime, make sure that you subscribe. If you're already a subscriber, then welcome back, and thank you for joining me and staying with me. You can follow me on Instagram also. You can see some little behind the scenes bits and pieces that I like to do. see a bit of the design process and what I like to get up to, and also sometimes the sneak preview of the up and coming projects I've got for you. Most of all, everybody, if something good comes your way, remember to pay it forward, because we all can. Till next time, it's Uru from me.